Okay, I'll go ahead and get started with just a quick welcome for everyone who's here. I'm sure more people will be trickling in as we go. Thank you everyone for joining us for the first webinar hosted by the Lotus Project. Just as a quick introduction, the Lotus Project is a center for Asian American and Asian immigrant child trauma-informed care and prevention. I think I also want to acknowledge that everyone is here because we know how important it is to continue learning about and having these conversations about anti-Asian hate and its impact on our communities. I'm sure many of us feel the immense weight from the recent shootings in Monterey Park at the Lunar New Year celebration, as well as the Half Moon Bay shooting that occurred just less than 2 days afterwards. We want to acknowledge the overwhelm, the anger, frustration, and sadness that the Asian community is grappling with right now, and that it is so important to hold space for that grief. We want to share gratitude for you all for showing up to this webinar and hope that this will be a space where we can take a step back to unpack the bigger picture of anti-Asian hate, trauma, and talk about next steps. And so I want to go into some logistics for the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Lotus Project website within the next week. We will follow up with an email with a link to the recordings to everyone who registered, and also include a feedback evaluation form and additional info in that follow-up email. There is a Zoom chat as well as a Q&A function. So feel free to use the Zoom chat to introduce yourselves, where you're from, engage with one another. And the Q&A chat is going to be for questions specific to the presentations and webinar content, as well as any additional questions that you may have for us. And another function is that you can upvote the questions that most resonate with you or that you're most interested in hearing about. Given time constraints for the webinar, we will most likely only be able to pose maybe 2 or 3 of those questions to speakers during the panel discussion portion at the end. And also please use respectful language in the chat and Q&A. And last logistic note, if you are seeking continuing education credits or you need your attendance records taken, please make sure either your displayed Zoom name matches the name in your registration, or you can type your name in the chat. And for those that are seeking CE credits, please also submit the webinar evaluation at the end, and the CE certificate will be emailed to you later in this month. So I will go ahead and introduce our moderator for the remainder of this webinar, Dr. Dorothy Chin. Dr. Dorothy Chin is an associate research psychologist at the UCLA Center for Culture, Trauma, and Mental Health Disparities at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Her research examines the effects of community and interpersonal trauma on psychological functioning, including depression, anxiety, and PTSD among minoritized populations. And an author of over 60 scholarly articles and a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Chin serves on the executive committee of the Trauma Psychology Division of the American Psychological Association and writes a blog for Psychology Today entitled A Different Lens, Psychology from Multicultural, Working Class, and Women-Centered Perspectives. And I'll go ahead and let Dr. Chin take it from here.
Thank you, Ellen, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone. I am so pleased to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers today, and we're going to start with Dr. Russell Jeung, Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Dr. Jeung is an author of books and articles on race and religion. In March 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, along with Chinese for Affirmative Action and the AAPI Equity Alliance. Stop AAPI Hate was awarded the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year. Dr. Jeung has been named one of Time's 100 most influential persons, as well as the Bloomberg 50 and Politico 50 most impactful persons. The Asia Society honored him with the Game Changer Award in 2022. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks a lot, Professor Chin. And I'd like to thank the Lotus Project today for holding this really important webinar as we mourn Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. Actually, I would like to take a moment of silence for myself and for each of you, just to grieve and to remember the victims and their family members. So if we could take a moment of silence, I'd appreciate it. Thanks. So, as Dorothy said, we created Stop AAPI Hate in the start of 2020 because we knew whenever diseases come from Asia, Asians get blamed. Asians then face racist violence and also face racist policies. So we wanted to be prepared and track the racism. And immediately after we launched, we received thousands of reports from across the nation that were just harrowing. And to give you a sense of what's been happening over the last 3 years, you probably already know personally, but to give you a sense, we're going to share a couple of incidents that occurred, and they all impacted elderly. And as we talk about racial trauma, each of these individuals have been impacted. And what I'd like you to do is, as you listen to these stories, I want you to put yourself in their shoes, feel what you think you would feel if you experience what they experience. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat a few of your words of response. So Sadiq, if you could begin, please.
Sure. Customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I'm mostly Chinese and my family has been in St. Louis since the 1860s. I'm fourth generation in St. Louis, but I guess I'll never be an American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy.
I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking me my upper back. Subsequently, verbal attacks occurred with "shut up, you monkey," "if you, Chinaman, go back to China, bringing that Chinese virus over here."
On my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" when she passed me. I was stunned by her words and caused me fear and be alert of my surroundings.
My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then said, "You need to go back from where you come from." We were shocked to hear this.
Waiting to enter the pharmacy to get prescription, group of construction workers, not social distancing, made fun of me, faking coughing, spitting, and made slant eyes. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country. I was the reason his father died. Mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is scariest and saddest experience I have had in the US since about 1977.
As I was leaving the restaurant, white males stormed up to me and verbally harassed me and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you effing Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to an officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone.
Thanks. So if you could put in the chat a few words of your emotional response to these incidents. So I see sadness, anger, fear, heartbroken, outraged, horrified, alienated, pain, infuriated, discouraged, rage, grief, embarrassed, fear, anger, heartbroken, fear, worry, livid, disgust, horrified. So thanks. And as you know, all the words and the emotions that you're expressing are what I think the broader Asian American and Pacific Islander community are feeling right now. They're all words of trauma, words such as anger, depression, hyperanxiety, vigilance, hypervigilance. And I'm arguing that this is really a period of collective racial trauma for the Asian American community over the last couple of years. It's collective because 1 out of 5 Asian Americans experienced this type of racism recently. That's over 4 million cases of hate. It's racial because people aren't attacking us as individuals knowing us, but they're attacking us simply by the way we look. And it's traumatizing because 1 out of 5 of us have experienced this hate, and 1 out of 5 of us who experience hate have 3 or more of these long-term symptoms of issues like anger, hypervigilance, avoidance of places, and depression. Those of us who don't experience it directly, the racism, we experience the racism vicariously. When we see an elder attacked, we can't help but think about our own elders. And so the trauma doesn't just impact the victim directly, but impacts the broader community. So this has been a really difficult time, and I'm really glad that you're here to help our community process through it. To give you a quick sense of what's happening, the racism isn't all hate crimes. There's 4 main categories of racism. We at Stop AAPI Hate identified 4 categories. The first, you can see on the bottom, 11% of the cases are civil rights violations, work discrimination, being barred from ride shares. About 9% of the cases are online cyber racism that young people face a lot. They see stereotypic offensive posts almost regularly on a weekly, daily basis. Microaggressions make up the bulk. 2/3 of the cases are verbal harassment. We're getting shunned and avoided in 18% of the cases. But again, they're not micro in impact, they're traumatizing. And finally, the last category is physical assault, for which a hate crime may be prosecuted. We were coughed and spat on so often that I actually created a special checkoff category so that people could quickly mark that they were coughed or spat upon. And in terms of physical assault, we have bottles and rocks thrown at us. People push and shove us, try to run us over with their cars. I saw so much violence. I saw so much antagonism that sadly I wasn't surprised to see elderlies killed on the streets. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shootings because I knew the extent and the depth of the racism against our communities. And the impacts have been really, really broad and deep. Just this past week, a new survey found that about 2/3 of Asian Americans found that the violence has had a negative impact on their mental health. And those who experience direct racism, again, 1 out of 5 experience trauma symptoms. And they've also, because of the trauma, have avoided going to necessary appointments like health checkups because they're afraid to go out. They have a high sense of not feeling safe. The impacts have been deadly, have been traumatizing, and they've also hurt us economically. Because of racism, people were avoiding Asian businesses, Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese nail salons. So those businesses, compared to non-Asian businesses, actually saw a clear decrease, and they had to often close even before government quarantines. That then led to businesses laying off large swaths of the Asian American working class. So in California, 83%, 8 out of 10 Asian Americans with a high school degree, those of us who are essential workers, those of us in the working class in the service sector, had to file for unemployment. That's 2.5 times more than others with the same educational background. And finally, we did face racist yellow peril policies that saw us as dangerous to America, that saw us as threats to the United States. The president at the time banned Chinese scientists and researchers and then extended the stop immigration visas altogether. He cut refugee resettlement, he cut H-1B visas. All these policies disproportionately targeted Asians, disproportionately harmed Asians, and again saw us as the yellow peril, as threats to the nation's security, its public health, and its welfare. So what's causing the racism? I really want to quickly go over. The racism isn't new. We knew it was coming, and it's clear that what happened in recent years was just a repeat of history, the use of political rhetoric to stir up animosity and to scapegoat Asians, media representations that were also stereotypic and inciting fear. And both the political rhetoric and the media representations today really hearken to the yellow peril stereotype that I want to talk about. This is a notion that Asians are an existential threat to the West, that we're dangerous, that we as Asians are coming from the East to invade the West with our hordes of people and with our disease-ridden bodies. And because this yellow peril stereotype has existed in the past and has become operational again today, I want to show you the connection of how this stereotype has then influenced health policies that then have really impacted our communities. So I just want to go through a couple of historical examples of how the yellow peril has operated, again, impacting interpersonal violence and racism. Here in the latter part of the 19th century, you could see that the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen to be specters of death coming out of San Francisco Chinatown. Because Chinese and Asians were seen as being disease-ridden, because we were medically scapegoated, that became the rationale, the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The stereotype that we were, again, imperiling the US with our diseases, the fact that we were seen as stealing white workers' jobs, the fact that we were seen as heathen coolies who were not assimilable, they were all rationales that led to a policy of exclusion. But that exclusion by the government didn't actually quell the violence, but actually then sanctioned further violence by mobs and by people at the interpersonal level. What a lot of people don't know is after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, we had a period what I call the Yellow Terror. In 1885 through 1886, over 160 Chinese settlements were actually forcibly driven out by mob violence. People were lynched, people were murdered, people faced arson. These weren't individuals, these were entire communities being driven out. My own family settled in Monterey, California by the Monterey Aquarium. It was a thriving community of over 200 people, but white townspeople wanted them out. And when they wouldn't leave after an eviction, a fire burned down the entire village. So my own great-grandparents who had lived there for 4 decades lost everything and had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge. So this trauma, this type of experience related to the exclusion policies. In 1900, the bubonic plague was found in San Francisco. And again, because we're seen as the threat, they allowed whites to leave San Francisco Chinatown, but they kept and segregated Chinese in the area with barbed wire, ropes, and armed guards. In Santa Ana and Honolulu Chinatowns, health officials burned down the entire Chinatowns, leaving thousands homeless. So this headline reads that the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. Again, because of the yellow peril, Asians are scapegoated for their diseases and then face racial policies and interpersonal violence. This continued at Angel Island, the immigration center in San Francisco Bay. Now, migrants in the 1920s through the 1940s, when they stopped at Ellis Island coming from Europe, they were processed and allowed to disembark within 2 to 3 hours. Asians, on the other hand, faced mass detention because, again, we were seen as the yellow peril carrying diseases. Again, under locked barracks with armed guards, we faced mass detention and had to go through lengthy interrogations because we were seen as illegal aliens. Because we were seen as, again, disease carrying, we had to go through lengthy medical checkups. And for women, it was even more shameful and traumatizing because they had to strip naked before white men. The mass detention on average lasted weeks, and over 5% of those who spent their family fortunes to come to America, at least 5% were deported back for arbitrary health reasons. And so poetry on Angel Island actually shares the stories of injustice and pain and trauma that our community faced. In the 1940s, again, 1930s, tuberculosis was an epidemic, and Chinese, Asians, and the Latinx community had higher rates, epidemic rates of tuberculosis TB. The policy back then, and well, it wasn't because our ethnic groups or our racial groups were, genetically predisposed to TB. It was because of environmental racism. Because we were segregated again and had to live in more impoverished, squalid conditions, it was easier to catch tuberculosis. And the health policy back then was to actually quarantine people, first of all, in county hospitals, and then to separate families from their children. So both sides of my family experienced long-term family separation because my aunts and uncles, my mom, and my grandmother got tuberculosis, and the families had to be separated from their kids. So you can see from my own family's experience, because of this yellow peril fear of Asians that were outsiders who don't belong, because of race and because of health policy, my family has had to experience the traumatizing impact of mass displacement and dispossession, had to face the trauma of mass detention, of segregation, of deportation, and of long-term family separation. These traumas inevitably have intergenerational impacts on me, and then subsequently, sadly, on what I fear is my own children as we experience COVID-19 anti-Asian hate. And so unless we address it now, unless we deal with the trauma, I'm really concerned that hurt people will hurt people, that as Asians become traumatized by racism, we become racist ourselves, become anti-white and anti-Black. And unless we deal with it, we take out that trauma either on our family members and those closest to us, or we internalize the trauma. So I'm really appreciative of this time to learn from experts, to see how we as a community can work together to really address the trauma that we're experiencing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Russell, for that. That was a lot. And I think, you know, 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 I I noticed that in the chat, you know, a lot of people were noting a lot of parallel instances through history with different groups in our communities. And we're going to circle back to that when we start discussing all of that. But I feel like I could listen to you for a much longer time on all the history. And thank you for sharing your personal history as well. That was so much and so powerful. So next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sherry Wang. Dr. Sherry Wang is an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. She's a licensed psychologist, anti-racist educator, and media and mental health media contributor. Her scholarship is rooted in advocating for the voices of BIPOC communities, focusing on the ways in which sociocultural determinants contribute to ethnic and racial health disparities. Dr. Wang co-chairs the Asian American Psychological Association's Division on Women and is a representative to the APA Council for Division 45, which is the Society for Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. Since the start of COVID-19, Dr. Wang has been featured often in the media on anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, and cross-racial coalition building. Welcome, Sherry.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to continue onward. We actually have a plan for how all of this is connected, right? After Dr. Jeung, after Russell has presented what he did with a little bit of the historical context, to kind of bring that onward into some of the work that I've done. And so, you know, throughout this period, we've had different data collections, right? From, for example, Asian Americans advancing justice to, you know, Dr. Russell Jeung being one of the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate, really collecting advocacy data, right, on the influx of anti-Asian racism and hate incidents. And so what I'm going to talk about today is actually from data that I've collected. So it's also kind of evidence-based in that way, where my interest was really looking not specifically at hate incidents per se, because I think as kind of typical lay people, how do you distinguish hate incident from a quote unquote just from an experience of racism? And so in 2020, I started collecting data online, right? We were kind of sheltering in place, social distancing, but an online study to understand what people's experiences of racism are, just kind of generally. And I asked a lot of questions about social support, about what happens in the aftermath. And I have a couple of papers that have been published since that I'm happy to share. But really capturing kind of experiences of racism and really kind of from a trauma-informed perspective. What do people need and what did they not get? And so I'm going to be talking about it today from this. And one of the main theme, I guess, what I want to convey, the main point, is really that racism isn't just what happened in the immediate incident, okay? Something did something to us or to you. But it includes what did not happen as well, right? The apathy of the people that were standing around, the subsequent silence, feelings that don't get validated, stories that never get told. And so part of Asian American racial trauma isn't just what happened, but it's also the aftermath of what happened. And so, you know, in 2020, I actually started my professional Instagram account to really kind of try to promote anti-racist education and training and community, right? For our communities collectively, BIPOC communities, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color, and also specifically for Asian Americans, because that is my lived experience as well, of how pained we were, not just in terms of what was happening, but the aftermath of the invisibility of a racial trauma, right? The kind of, well, it's not overt enough, it's not direct enough, unless there's indisputable violence. And so what that also means in terms of the ways in which as a society we're socialized to only care through racial trauma porn. Okay. And so in terms of my findings then, one of the main things that I want to highlight is really kind of going to be based on showcasing theory. And so you've heard you know, Dr. Jeung, Russell talk a little bit about the yellow peril. And I want to tie it together today with yellow peril, which, you know, is really about, you know, the 19th, 20th century, right? The fear of the yellow race dominating white race. So that it's not just like an influx of people, but people that are non-white, okay? And so this fear of like yellow barbarians who are less than, and yet terrifying because of the hordes in which they were coming in. It's actually not that different from what researchers or scholars have also described the same two sides of the same coin, which is the model minority myth. Okay, and you might be like, I don't know, how is that connected? Well, the model minority myth really speaks to a comparison of this kind of myth, the stereotype of saying, hey, look at this model group, okay, that has pulled themselves up by the bootstrap. Look at all the things they've overcome, right? They've overcome things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, of Japanese internment camp, and then I mean, there's a whole host of events that have happened too, but kind of major events that I think we can all refer to. But really looking at like, look at all the things they've overcome, and let's see what we want to see about them. Okay, let's ignore the fact that they're diverse, that they've suffered as victims of racism, and focus on really from a colorblind approach. Okay, now racism actually is something you can get over if you work hard enough. So hey, when there's a model minority, there's also a problem minority. Hey, Black people. Okay, it's a comparison that has never been meant to make Asian Americans look good, but purely to make other communities of color look bad, and to use Asian Americans as the example of a colorblind world can exist. Okay, valorizing us as successful and hardworking, and then in doing so, allowing white America to pit us against Black community as well as other communities of color. How is this similar to yellow peril? Well, yellow peril was this fear of domination. And this model minority myth is also one that initially you would think, well, it's about pitting people of color together. But then there was an article, right, in the 90s where it was like, wait a minute, these Asian American, quote unquote, whiz kids, they're outperforming white people. So you see then the fear of Asian Americans then kind of reemerges, right, in this more salient way. Now, how does this all come into racial triangulation? Well, Claire Jean Kim has actually, this is a figure, right, from her work, really highlighting the location of Asian Americans. And what that means is, as Asian Americans, we are positioned, okay? We are in some ways like, our positioning is located between whiteness, right, and white people, and Blackness and Black people as well. And that we can only be understood between these two extreme ends, okay? And so we may be relatively valorized, as in we are maybe kind of celebrated, you know, it's a fake celebration. It's a caricature of things like, oh, they're quiet, they're submissive, they're deferential. So these aren't actually real characteristics of us, right? They're not politically active. That argument was really, they're not politically active compared to Black people. So, hey, Black people, stop being politically active. That's how we were used, right? And exploited. And so, but we were really understood only in this way as, so we're closer to whiteness, but we can never be white. We will never have the privileges of whiteness or white people, okay? And yet then, so in terms of superiority, we're higher up on this hierarchy. But then if you look at the x-axis, foreigner to insider, we will, no matter what we do, be considered immutably foreign and unassimilable, okay? And that's speaking to the ostracism of us in terms of civic participation, and really treating us, no matter how many generations you've been in this country, to be asked comments like, well, your English is so good, as though we can't possibly be from here, okay? And so what I wanted to showcase, and what I've shown in my research, is not just kind of the playing out of the Asian American locationing and the experience, but what that looks like in the aftermath and really during, right, racism. And what that's looked like is this. In the aftermath, okay, so after you've experienced racism, and you go to your trusted people. This is not about reporting a hate incident or going to a portal or going to authority. You go to the people you love and care and you hope will support you. And the responses that Asian Americans have gotten from the data I've collected are things like, what? Asian Americans experience racism? Aren't you guys like white or something? Okay, to things like, welcome to the club. Now you finally know what it's like to be a person of color. Okay. And so this is coming from outside messages, and certainly that we get a lot of these outside messages, but Asian Americans then also internalize these messages. If you think about the climate of 2020, racial reckoning, the brutal murder of George Floyd, then Asian Americans, as well as non-Asian Americans, are really conveying the message of like, well, Asian American racism is not that bad, right? It's not as bad as what happened to Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor. And there becomes this kind of oppression Olympics. You see, if I go up that slide, your experience is not that bad. It's not like here, okay? Okay, so it's a very lonely place to be, right? And then you get this, right? Because the pitting, right, of Asian Americans and Black Americans of like, well, Is it Black Lives Matter or Asian Lives Matter? So co-opting of language too, right? In terms of then the feeling of like, I can only choose one, or how come our society can only pay attention to one and not the other? And so the importance of really highlighting, actually, this is actually replaying, right? And kind of successfully capitulating the default status, which is that, hey, people of color, you fight to the death amongst yourselves for resources and attention. If you've watched Squid Games before, that's really what it is. People of color fight amongst yourselves. And so if we really are against racism, we strive to be anti-racist, we want to combat white supremacy, we don't ever have to choose, okay? That's a really important message, but one that really people have struggled with, right? Because of the sense of you know, I can only choose one community, okay? Okay, so this is kind of messages we get from outsiders. Well, we also from within our community, well-intentioned, okay? Asian American activists, right? Asian American leaders even, saying things like, hey, you must speak out, you must speak up, you must speak out, you have to report what happened to you, okay? Because if you don't, then you are confirming, you are now re-perpetrating the model minority myth, which is that we are a quiet, submissive, deferential group that does not engage in political participation. So now, not only is it that as a victim of trauma, okay, not only are you not able to kind of lick your wounds or even kind of process yourself what happened or attend to your emotional needs, there's a pressure in some ways that if you don't speak up, if you don't speak out, then you are a bad Asian. Okay. I mean, think about it. So I'm a mental health provider. I'm a psychologist, right? I'm a licensed counseling psychologist. We do not do this when we work with people who have been assaulted, right? Victims and survivors of assault. We don't force them to report because we know reporting can actually be more traumatic. We let people tell their stories. We maybe give them resources so they can decide if they want to report, and then we prepare them for the likelihood of being re-traumatized. This is not what our society and what our communities have gotten. We also got messages of like, you know what, the reason we're here today where people are not speaking out for us is because we haven't done enough, okay? Asian Americans, we have been politically inactive. We haven't been like the Black American community. We haven't showed up for our Native American siblings. We haven't done the things for our Latino siblings. So this is why we kind of deserve to be here. Just kind of like victim blaming, right? And then there's this other notion of we need to come together, we need to be united, and as wonderful as that idea is in theory, right? The truth is, as Asians, and we need to be united even within Asian Americans, that messaging is somewhat problematic because you see, as Asians, quote unquote, we're a very diverse group of people from different countries and cultures. We have gone to war with each other. There are many of us from families with grandparents or parents who are like, you cannot marry somebody, you cannot date somebody from this other Asian country because we have history, right? So I took this tweet, it's a public tweet, okay? You can publicly look it up, from this person who said, my mom said we should speak Thai in public so we don't get targeted for speaking Mandarin. And I think it's so sweet that she's nice enough to believe that these stupid fucking racists can differentiate between Asian languages. Okay. So this assumption that we need to come together, we need to unite, that's also false. And actually within families, the lack of understanding of mental health may be like, dude, we fled from our countries, right? We sought refuge as refugees or as immigrants to give you a better life in the US. And now you're scared of people saying something bad to you. Get over it.
Sherry, just want to let you know 3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. So messaging, right, for us, that really is saying, get over it, okay? It's not a big deal. Even from well-intentioned family members and partners, okay? So you can look at some of my publications there too. I'm happy to share that. Okay, so what I really want to highlight though, right, is that all of this anti-Asian racism during COVID or at the height of COVID is not unique to us. Look at the fullest look yet of racial inequality or inequity of coronavirus, dated July 5th, 2020. Okay, the New York Times did a thing on the fullest look yet, and look, where are Asian Americans at this fullest look? We're not there. Well, also, once you start to notice these things, you'll also be like, where are Native Americans? We also know have been devastated by COVID. Okay, so Asian Americans are frequently left out of data or dismissed as other, okay, in reports that are meant to highlight racial ethnic disparities. New York Times is not unique in that. How about academic and kind of educational opportunities. Ford Foundation actually now includes Native Pacific Islanders, but they didn't before when I was in graduate school. To this day, the National Science Foundation still does not consider Asian Americans as an underrepresented minority group, describing us as overrepresented in science and engineering fields and employed scientists. Okay, we have been inconsistently included even in COVID-19 response policies and omitted altogether as a vulnerable population in the National Academy of Sciences Engineering Medicine's framework for equitable allocation of a COVID-19 vaccine. Sorry, that was a lot, but it really shows that it's our invisibility that is also our experience of racism and racial trauma, okay? When we have attention, media mixes up who our people are, okay? Michelle Go was a victim of racism or of violence who died, right, in New York. Michelle Wu is the first woman and person of color elected mayor of Boston. Media conflated the two, okay? Also problematic is having a president who way better than the previous presidential administration in treatment of racial justice issues, but saying that attacks against Asian Americans are un-American. That is not true. It is the fabric of U.S. patriotism to be Asian American, to be anti-Asians, right? From what Russell described, Chinese Inclusion Act, to South Asians coming to this country being like, let me not be connected to Chinese people, to proving patriotism to be anti-Americans of Japanese descent. Okay, and to Chinese people wearing badges that say, I'm not Japanese, don't round me up during World War II, okay? And to our treatment of South Asians, Muslims, and then subsequently Sikh communities, because people can't tell the difference between different racial and religious communities, okay? The Monterey Park shootings, the Half Moon Bay shootings, it has revived fears. I mean, this is still very active for us in terms of if it's not a hate crime, people don't take it seriously, or that they think it doesn't hurt us, right? Right now, there's a simultaneous possibility of Asian American history being taught in Florida public schools if this new bill passes, which may be exciting, but what does it mean that it's happening at the same time that Florida is suppressing Black history education? There's gonna be these issues that keep coming up over and over. And so really understanding that the cyclical pattern. I'll stop here because I know my time is up. Thank you so much, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Sherry. You just connected so many dots and gave us the context of this umbrella of under a white supremacist ideology is where all of these theories come from. And without knowing the whole picture, you know, we're left with, oh, you know, we are the model minority. And, you know, that's been proffered for years and years. And so I think that, you know, a lot of us resonated with so much of what you had to say. And we will get back to a discussion on that as well. So thank you. So next I'd like to introduce Cruz Chan, a Cantonese and Mandarin speaking clinician. Cruz graduated from the California Institute of Integral Studies with a master's in counseling psychology with a specialization in drama therapy. Cruz is a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a registered drama therapist with a background in providing mental health services to children, youth, families, and adults in outpatient and school-based programs. In Cruz's new role as clinical manager, Cruz will be further developing the RAM's Healing for Asians program, which provides trauma-informed mental health services to limited English-speaking Asian victims of crime. Thank you so much, Cruz.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm going to just put up the slide. Can everyone see it? Okay. So in this last presentation of this webinar, I'm going to take a look of the, just give a brief description about mental health impacts of racism and trauma on specific population, Asian American and Asian immigrant communities. Here is the agenda. We are going through to just describe some mental health symptoms according to DSM-5 and some common feelings and inner voices. After that, we notice all these challenges. What can we do? We can start from some self-care, take care of ourselves. And also we will talk about some stigma of seeking help. And last, we are going to provide some resources. First of all, some mental health symptoms according to DSM-5, some depressive symptom, like we may start to feel we lost interest of doing something that we used to feel joy to do, like going to the theater or hanging out with friends or like going to the concert. We may still able to do the same thing, but we do not feel the same way. We may also lose motivation to do things like finish our daily task of going to school, going to work. That is like just our daily life routine that we feel we have no motivation. We may also have like extreme cycles of emotions, but on the other hand, we may feel like, oh, it's safer to not feel anything. So that will be like an extreme cycle that also make us feel tired. Our body have memories, chronic stress, maybe our muscle will feel so intense or tension that at all time, our body is ready to fight because what we just experienced. Agoraphobia, people may feel like afraid of going out, like taking public transportation or going into space that is like with a lot of people, especially if the event happened when the person was in the public transportation or is in a crowd space with full of people. We also may have some OCD symptoms, like we keep checking if we lock the door, if we lock the garage before we leave, especially if the event happened in the space that we used to feel safe, let's say our home. Some PTSD symptoms, like we may have difficulty to fall asleep. Even though we fall asleep, we will have difficulty to like stay asleep. We may be wake up by nightmares. Fear of separation from loved one. And these symptoms is more common within children, because when children experience something very strong, they may feel that, oh, if I separate with my parents, is there something bad going to happen to them or to me? And separation anxiety may occur for children. Some flashback about like sounds, images will just come randomly in our daily life. And all these symptoms is just part of this. It's not just all, it's just like examples. But all these symptoms that happen in our brain and in our body can be very distracting. Some feelings that we may have for people who experience trauma or like some being a victim, that we will feel lonely, like, oh, why this happened to me? Is I am the only one? Maybe this just happened to me, but not others. Yes, we will feel anger, sadness, we'll feel afraid, we'll feel shocked, because all these things is, we do not predict, we do not know that will happen, but once it happened, we'll have a lot of different feelings. If that event or that strong, unpredictable like crimes that happen, if that is something related to like some physical contact, like sexual harassment, that after that, people may feel that I am not clean, my body is dirty. That those intense feelings will just also appear and stay in our body. We may feel disappointed. Why at that time no one was helping me? We feel ashamed of sharing the story to others. We feel embarrassed of what happened. We feel that the society, the environment that we live is not safe anymore. We feel powerless, we feel helpless because we were not able to protect ourselves. And all these feelings, we can conclude in one word, that is overwhelming. And those feelings are only just part of the feeling that we may have, it's not all. And those feelings may also shape into a longer term, that we may have some inner voices that will create, that we develop. Here also, as just part of that, we will have like 5 main categories of self-pity, self-critic, self-blaming, self-image, and also extend to the whole environment of self-belief. In this category of self-pity, that we will feel that, oh, what happened to me is the universe chose to us. So what happened? I deserve this. I am such a victim. I was a victim. I am a victim. I will be a victim in my whole life. Some of the example of self-criticize, we will feel that it is my fault. It is my thought of being an Asian. It is my thought of being an elderly, and it is my thought of being an immigrant. And notice that all these Asian elderly or immigrants are our identity that we cannot change. We cannot change we are not an Asian. We cannot change our age. We cannot go back to past or go into the future. We are who we are at this moment, but we are blaming ourselves of who we are. On the other hand, maybe we also have some self-blaming of like, oh, if I react in a different way, maybe something will be different. Or maybe I did something wrong. I should not go out at night. I should not dress in a certain way. I should not dress like a dress, like skirt when I go out. That we started to think, oh, if I did something differently, will the results happen in a different way? Then we started to blame on ourselves of what we did or what we did not do. Some self-image of inner voices, we may feel like, I am weak because I cannot protect myself. I cannot protect someone that I love. I am weak. I am a victim. I am a loser. And all these inner voices are very heavy that we can also extend to the environment that feels that the environment that we live now is not safe. I am not safe. We take a look of all these challenges in our body, in our emotions, in our brain. Can we do something? Yes, we can. We can start to take care of ourselves. Here are just several first steps that we can do. We started to shift and revamp the narrative that we describe the story. We can avoid using strong negative words to just describe what happened in a neutral way. We replace self-judging to some non-judgmental narrative. We stop blaming ourselves before anyone blaming us or blaming others. This is our own choice. And in the previous slides, we were talking about some challenges in our blame in emotion or in body that actually give us some messages. If we take those challenges to an opportunity to seek help, that can be a timing for us to make a change. We take the opportunity to look inside of what happened. We cannot change what happened. We cannot change our past. But what we can change is to provide a new eyesight, a new mindset to understand what happened and what is happening. That is our own choice. We take back the power. Community, last but not least. Connect with others who have experienced similar situation, that we can start to choose someone that we feel safe, we feel trust, we feel comfortable to share. I'm not talking about like share with anyone on the street. You just share with someone that you feel safe in your comfort zone, because something did not share that is secret and taboo. But things shared, that becomes stories. When stories shared, connection happened, then we will feel that actually I may not the only one. I'm not alone. I'm not lonely. We are in this together. But be careful. Choose someone that you feel safe and also comfortable to share. But we talk about like seeking help. Yes, is that easy? Yeah, it's not easy. So here we are talking about some stigma of seeking help, and I'm dividing three main stage of life, like children, teenagers, and adults, what the stigma may happen in the public and self. And we can also just reflect on ourselves. Is that true? And if we are part of this as well. For children who seek mental health support in the public, people may feel that, oh, this kid is a bad kid. This kid have some behavioral problem. If not because of the kid, maybe something wrong with the parents and the family. We started to blame the system, and we did not see the challenges itself of what happened to this kid. For these voices, the children can also just shape into some inner self, like blaming, saying that I have something wrong. I did something wrong. And seeing a therapist is such a punishment for me. I am not good enough. I am not as good as my peers or siblings, because in this stage of life, children create and build their own self-image by comparing themselves with other peers among their same group of age. For teenagers, this is a very special stage of life that they started to aware that, oh, actually I have freedom. I can make choice of my life. I can have future. I can start to think about if I want to go to the college or I want to work. And maybe I want to live by myself or I want to stay longer with my parents. There's a lot of potentials in this stage of group of people. But in the public, people may think that this group of people going to see therapists, going to see a mental health counselors, that for employers, I do not want to hire them because I don't know if they will be stable enough. Landlord may not rent to them because I don't know if they are able to earn money to pay the rent. Healthcare may offer a lower standard of care for this group of people. For them, teenagers, they feel that they're supposed to have the brightest future at this moment, will feel that I have no future. This is my life. I have no hope. And these thoughts need to have lower self-esteem, like, why I even bother? Someone like me is not worthy to seek help. They lost hope. For longer term, some mental health challenges like eating disorder, depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, all these things is just very dangerous for this group of people as well. Adults, people who seek mental health support are dangerous because as adults, oh, if they see a therapist, they think and feel in a different way. And people who are not majority, they are dangerous because they are unpredictable. They are incapable. For themselves as adults who are considering whether I am going to see a therapist or not, people may also feel that maybe I am dangerous because I can feel there's like an emotional wave in me that I don't even able to understand. Am I dangerous? Am I unpredictable? Or maybe I am incapable. With all these challenges, yes, they are here, but we can also take it as an opportunity to see this is the timing to make a change. We always say that, and one statement that I really like is, we do things, the real courage and braveness is not we do things without fear. It's we realize that fear exists. We decide to do it anyway. And that is the real courage. So we go through all this stigma. What's next? We can seek resources. And I noticed that time I'm not going to go through all the resources, but feel free to reach out after webinar, and we have other like resources that we can provide for clinical services, for other resources. I'm not just going to do it one by one because of the time. And yes, change. One more minute.
Okay, all right, please.
Change will not happen in one day. But what we are doing now, like today, hundreds of people all over the country, maybe outside of the country, stay together, spending the time, discuss it, aware this, accept this, and talk about this. This is the timing of making a change. Over time, until we realize and we notice, then we know change is happening, and we are the change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was such a powerful encapsulation of, all the feelings that we could have in response to trauma, as well as what we can do about it. And, when you were talking about the self-talk, I think that all of us resonated with doing that, ourselves at some point in our lives. Such important important points that you made. I want to thank all the panelists, and I, there's so much that has been raised, and I want to start with a question to all of you about the role of culture and in terms of trauma and processing trauma. Because one thing that I hear a lot, from parents and from, children of adult children of previous generations who say, I don't want to saddle my children with the pain of the past, such as in the Japanese incarceration, those who went to the camps will not talk about it, right? Like the poet Garrett Hongo, who's from Volcano, Hawaii, his parents were in the camps, but he said that he didn't even really know that they were there. And he wrote in this powerful essay that, he said that their injunction was silence, mine is to speak, because he's a writer now. So there is a gap between, what previous generations will talk about and what we feel we can talk about in terms of intergenerational trauma. A lot of you talked about that, right? So what do you think about processing trauma, but within the precepts of our culture and our cultural values?
I'd like to start, and thanks, Dorothy, for that great question. I think as we deal with trauma, and all of us experience trauma in different ways, that we can actually learn a lot from our Asian American elders. We realize our communities have gone through centuries of trauma already and already have great wisdom to help us process and handle it. Our countries of origin have gone through war, famine, a lot of us going through migration, it's been forced migration. So there's a lot of experience of trauma and therefore a lot of wisdom. So just to give you some of what I think are some of the cultural expectations is that I think our elders, especially compared to young people, are better equipped to handle trauma because of their expectations. That first of all, they expect hardship, right? They expect difficulty. If you're a Buddhist, you expect suffering. If you're Chinese, you expect you have a certain amount of constitutive luck. And so you may be a little bit more fatalistic, but that actually is a little bit more realistic than the typical American Disney perspective that everything's going to go well in my life and we're going to be happy, so don't worry, And so expectations have a lot to do with how well you can handle trauma. And I think in some ways, in studies comparing elders to young people, they have less trauma symptoms facing racism because our elders say, what do you expect in America? Of course you're going to face racism. What do you expect? Duh. Whereas young people expect America's supposed to be fair and equal, right? And so expectations have a lot to do with it. Again, our mindset also shapes. Do we separate our mental health from our health, right? And that's a big distinction. In Asian cultures, there is no concept of mental health, but there's an integrated body. So a lot of times, like Sherry and Cruz talked about, we experience mental health issues somatically. And so that's something, how we address mental health is through alternative health perspectives. But quickly, the third way I think that our cultures may be different is that in trauma, the Western model is trauma is individually experienced, so we need self-care, right? And that's Cruz's approach. It's individually experienced, so we need talk therapy to process our inner voices. It's very individualistic. And I think that another way we could address mental health, it's good to address it through the individual, but another way we can address it is through a collective processing, right? That we do community mental health, not just individual personal mental health. In the response to trauma, a lot of times people go into a fight or flight response, right? You experience something bad and you flee from it, or you fight back. And so you have an anger response or a fearful, depressive response. There's a third response, I think, that's really actually adaptive that I see the community doing in the face of trauma is beyond freeze or fleeing, Asians flock in the face of trauma and danger. So this isn't part of research writings. People don't talk about this flocking mechanism, but think about it. It's totally powerful and true to come together as a community for survival, for strength, for support, for grieving, for processing of the inner voices. And I think, just quickly, we need to think about how do Asians flock that provide protective resilience against trauma. And if you look at our religious traditions, people chant, people pray, people meditate, people sing in our religious communities. And all those ways are ways to reshape our thinking to have more positive inner voices. But it's done in a collective way. It's also done in an indirect way so that we're not just talking about our pain and re-traumatizing ourselves or re-triggering ourselves, but through the indirect processing, through chanting, through meditation, through prayer. Together, we realize that we have communal support, that we're all suffering together. And then I think our religious traditions help us process the pain, process the trauma to lead to move from anger and fear to compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. So for me, our Asian elders, our religious traditions are a source of strength that could help us deal with mental health in a communal way, in a collective way, in a flocking way. So I'll leave you with that. But I think there's a lot to be explored, a lot to learn from our Asian traditions that Western therapy has yet to access, or it's beginning to.
Yeah, I really like the flip side of the individual and collective trauma and looking at the strengths, of how we can turn our collectivism into strength as well.
I'd really like to add on that too, not only of just kind of recognizing our strengths, but also maybe critiquing, right? The ways in which we do westernized talk therapy. And there's some work that's really looked at the nature of therapy and how much it's rooted in Christian and even more specifically Catholic traditions of it being confessional, right? You go to a space, you talk about deep, dark, heavy stuff, and then it should be cathartic. But in terms of a lot of Eastern traditions, right, and where we feel like we get the most maybe out of kind of hard, to get out of hardship, we want advice, we want education, we want experiences from people who have walked through the path and be like, tell me what to do, tell me your story. And we are more indirect in our communication. I'll just talk, for example, when we do like college mental health services for Asian Americans, we never do like Asian American suicide prevention. We do a thing like academic achievement and how to be successful. And that's how we target Asian American students. So if you think about like our elders right now, right? And we think about the mass shootings that have happened, we would not go to San Gabriel Valley and be like, let's talk about mass shootings. Let's talk about gun violence, right? We would never directly speak about it in that way. And so I think rather than being like, how do we get our elders into therapy? How do we force them to do things in the ways that we're reading about in our textbooks and the way we've been trained, that the way we've been trained is quite Western and white and weird. I say weird because Western, educated, industrialized, right? Democratic, rich society. That's really where our scholarship is from and what we've normed good psychological health to look like.
I also want to just echo what Rochelle and Jerry just mentioned and develop more about the format of therapy itself. Like now we have a lot of different formats of therapy, and it can also, you have the freedom to do, like I can do text therapy or phone therapy or online, or like we can do talk therapy. Also, we can do like group therapy. And there's also a lot of different formats like expressive art therapy, or we can do drawing, dancing, drama therapy. And all these things, like if we just say therapy itself can be scary, but if we shape it, we frame it in another way, another format, that may be easier for them to take the first step.
Yeah, I love that. And within the culture, I think often about how devastating COVID was for our communities, particularly in light of, that we're cultures that gather in person. We're not really, at least speaking for myself, my family, and probably for a lot of people, we're not people who pick up the phone and chat for hours, partly because there can be a slight language difference between our parents, and the younger generation, and you just don't chat You get together and eat, and you know, during COVID, that was not possible. And so when you guys talk about, you know, chanting together and getting together, you know, that is so important in the culture in terms of healing and processing all the trauma. And in that sense, you know, it's not really that surprising that while we're still in this and in a community that's besieged by hate crimes and so forth, that you can have mental health issues that possibly lead to violence, you know, talking about the two shootings and the profile of the perpetrators being so different from other mass shooters, you know, older Asian men. But you think about, you know, enduring 2 years of isolation, possibly with mental health issues and alienation from their own community, you know, that those are so many factors that can go into the current state of mental health among Asians and Asian immigrants. So thank you for all those remarks. I think that there are a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A about this. So I want to get to that, which is about coalition building and among communities of color, right? And so, you know, now that we understand that there's a white supremacist narrative that, you know, perhaps tries to, with the intent of placing a wedge, you know, between communities of color, for example, in terms of racial triangulation theory, which really hit me hard when I learned about it, and so on and so forth. How do we start to change that narrative and work towards allyship and coalition building towards a common vision and goal of social justice? You know, there are a couple of questions about that when, you know, people who say that, how can I use my white privilege, or how can I, you know, as an African-American person, how can we work together and build a common language and common goals? Any of you could take it.
I'll jump in, and I
Yeah.
know we think we give like power and privilege. They're like dirty words these days, right? Like people have ended friendships by saying things like, "Oh, you're privileged," and that it really speaks to kind of, I think, our lack of understanding of the ways in which, like, who doesn't want privilege or power, and the ways in which what really would be helpful with us sharing our privilege and power with each other. I know for me, for example, you know, in terms of like anti-Asian racism, when non-Asians have spoken up, right, to say like, stop Asian hate, or, hey, you know, I really am concerned about my Asian American siblings, it makes a world of a difference than when I speak up. It's like, oh, Asian American woman speaking up, of course you care about your issue, right? And so similarly, I think when it comes to like issues like Black Lives Matter, it is so important for me to be really vocal about these issues, because it's just going to be taken differently in terms of it being like, this Black Lives Matter is a societal issue and not just a Black issue, right? Anti-Asian racism isn't just an Asian issue. It is a societal problem, and we all care about it. And I say that to really highlight, it's not a tit for tat thing, right? Like, I will speak up for you if you speak up for me. It's got to come from a place of like, I would do this no matter what other individuals do. I do it for our society. Like, we do it because we have the power to speak up for folks when they don't. Meaning that, like, it would be very hard for me to speak up on anti-Asian racism when I'm a victim, because I feel so marginalized and victimized and small. I need people around me to be like, this is not okay. What's happening to her is not okay. And the ways that I can speak up for people who I am not a member of, I'm not an insider, right? As a non-Black, right? In terms of thinking about ability status, class issues, LGBT, you know, sexual orientation. This power sharing is really about community building. And so I think about issues like policing right now. That's a really divisive issue within our communities, right? But then I think when you really understand like the racist roots of policing for Black Americans, and then really tying it together with like, hold on, Asian Americans have also been really afraid of police, thinking about documentation issues, about violence and the role of police, like that our deference to authorities is not the same as safety. And it's safety for who and at whose expense, right? And so I think as we become invested in thinking about like, who are we protecting and at whose expense, those are going to be issues that are going to be not just about protecting our own community, but realizing we are all community and it affects everybody.
So true. You guys want to add to that, or I guess I just want to say, you know, in terms of actual, you know, projects, you know, to do this, I think first, you know, we can recognize that whole umbrella, right? That, I mean, the whole divide and conquer, you know, I remember marching in college, you know, Russell, you might remember this too, where that was talked about, right? You know, Jesse Jackson came and, you know, we marched and so forth. And so things, you know, things replay themselves. And, you know, from the history that you all talked about in Asian American history to now, you know, and so the narrative goes on. So I guess, you know, as we look to the future, pie in the sky stuff, you know, what do you guys think, you know, in terms of, because we have a lot of people here at this webinar who want to do something, right? And you know, they want more webinars, they want more knowledge, but they also want to build something. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, I think what we recognize that our communities have been divided through white supremacy. And so we don't hear the stories of solidarity in the past, right? So just as I shared the yellow peril stereotype, there's been long stories, long histories of our communities of color in the United States working together, supporting each other. You know, I talked about the Monterey village being burnt down by great-grandparents. There's actually, history says that a Black cavalry troop actually came down to try to, you know, help with one of the fires. You know, where I come from at San Francisco State, we had the Third World Liberation Front that went on strike with the Black student unions to create ethnic studies. So there's a long story of solidarity. And even today, when you think about it, in terms of politics, Asian Americans are voting with other communities of color. So we are already working as a community. Asian Americans voting patterns do sort of reflect that of Black and Latino voting patterns. And so there is solidarity there if that's what we consider solidarity. But a deeper level of solidarity is this notion of linked fate, that what happens to someone in another community is going to impact my fate and my own sense of well-being and safety, right? It's like what happens to you happens to me. What hurts you hurts me. And you see those deeper values of allyship and solidarity, especially on the neighborhood basis, I think. So ways people can work in solidarity is by voting, again, to find common issues. I think, again, developing models of community mental health on the neighborhood level, where people, again, translate their sense of powerlessness, their sense of anger about conditions to working towards a greater good is actually really good for people's mental health, right? So just efforts at community gardens and neighborhood improvement are really powerful. Again, we need ways to channel the trauma from our powerlessness to actually, you know, enacting our powers together. So for me, I do a lot of neighborhood work just because it helps me connect and build that allyship with other groups of people.
I think that agency is so crucial, right? And I think a key thing is, I think for us to do this work, we cannot be motivated by shaming or blaming each other or ourselves. I have major reactions to the whole like, speak up, speak out, specifically when it's directed to Asian Americans, right? Because of the model minority piece and like just how much that is being recreated to box us in the model minority, right? And then saying like, move out of the box. You're still centering the box. That is the model minority myth. And so this notion of like, you do not have to speak up and speak out to be activistic or to do solidarity work. There are so many different ways to do it, and do it when you are safe. I think that's a safe. I spent 2 years in Mississippi as my first faculty job, and my grad school was in Nebraska, right? So during COVID, I really thought, I am now in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I can say things now that I would have been physically scared maybe to say, or that would have really outed me in terms of like, We don't, maybe this demographic form, this survey that is supposedly should be anonymous, but it's an Asian American woman around this age frame with this educational status. I would be so identifiable, right? In so many ways. So I think safety is such a, if you don't feel safe, you can't do it. It's okay. You just protect what you got, right? You've got to be in a place where you feel there's agency. Because I think that's where, if we're going to be doing allyship work, solidarity work, we have to feel motivated, and we have to have the bandwidth to be like, I'm caring for my community. And not because it has a direct benefit to me, but because I want to. This is the society I want to be part of and I want to build. And so I think that it has to come from a position of a place of empowerment and motivation. Otherwise, it is not sustainable, and you will burn out and you will be resentful, right?
Yeah, I love that, because this itself constitutes support, for me and for so many others, just to gather together with you all. And I love, Russell, what you said about a common fate, because my favorite Martin Luther King quote is that, we share, and I'm just paraphrasing, we share a garment. Okay, somebody help me. We share the same garment of destiny, something like that. The garment of destiny, and I love that. And so I think that even though, I really like when someone says, how can I use my privilege? It's not just you're helping us, we're all damaged, no matter what race you are by racism. It's damaging to the soul of not just the individual, but of the communities and of the entire country. Our whole country is stained by the legacy of slavery, upon which really, our country was founded. So, it's not just minoritized individuals and white privilege, it's really all of us that's been damaged by all this, and it takes all of us to heal. And I think that's one of the things that we are all trying to do. All of you who are attending this webinar, as well as all of us who are speaking. So I really thank you all for that. I think we have 6 minutes. So maybe first I should say what's on everybody's minds is that you guys are all badasses. Am I right? Everyone in saying that? Sherry, Cruz, Russell. I'm following the chat, and I see that everybody wants more. And I say, oh, can he speak more? Can they speak more? I mean, yeah, because this is the first of 3 webinars that the Lotus Project is putting on, and there's actually an in-person workshop following the 3 webinars. If everybody wants to get together, which is going to be in San Francisco. So there's a lot more to look forward to. And I think that someone also asked, if we were individually responsive to further questions on email, and I know that I am. So you can find my email, in the forum. So last words from our distinguished panel. Any last words from you guys? No? Okay, so I just want to, on behalf of everyone, thank you for your enlightening comments and thoughts, and it's all food for thought. I know that going forward, we'll be thinking about it. And I want to thank all the attendees for coming, and everybody stay safe, take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also want to just add on to that, that we will be, we recorded this webinar, and so that will be sent out along with the follow-up email and everything, with the webinar evaluation form. If you're seeking CE units, then definitely fill that out. It'll be really helpful for us to improve future webinars as well. And I'll go ahead and also just drop a kind of like timeline of the future 2 webinars that are coming up of the series, and also the workshop. So you can look out for that as well. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Dorothy for facilitating and moderating such an important conversation and just the flow of this entire event. Thank you, everyone.